The rogue came out of the dark tree line with his teeth already bared, and Elena had less than a second to decide whether she would live through the next 3 breaths. She did not think. 9 years of training took over before conscious thought could slow her down. She pivoted on her back foot, drove her knife up under his ribs, and felt the hot rush of blood spill over her knuckles as he crumpled at the edge of the nursery path, 10 steps from the window, where 6 sleeping pups lay unaware that death had nearly walked through their door. Her heart was still slamming against her chest when the guards arrived, and it was still slamming when Damien arrived a moment after them, his broad shoulders filling the narrow gate like a wall thrown up against the night. He took one look at the body, one look at the blood soaking through Elena's sleeve, and his face went hard and unreadable in the way it always did before a storm. "Explain," he said. "Not are you hurt, not thank you. Explain." That single word, cold and clipped, told Elena everything she needed to know about where she stood after 9 years of loving this man in silence. She wiped the blade against her thigh, forced her voice to stay level, and gave him the report he wanted, because that was what she had always given him: facts, efficiency. Nothing that might reveal the storm still raging beneath her ribs. "A rogue came through the eastern tree line," she said. "He was moving toward the nursery wing. I stopped him before he reached it." A murmur rippled through the gathering crowd of pack members, who had spilled out of the house at the sound of the commotion. The nursery wing held 6 pups under the age of 4, including Damien's baby cousin, the last living relative from his mother's side of the family. If the rogue had gotten through, tonight would not have ended with Elena standing calm and blood-streaked in the moonlight. It would have ended in a grief too large for any pack to survive easily. Damien's jaw tightened as the weight of what had almost happened settled over him. For one strange, fragile heartbeat, something flickered behind his dark eyes that might have been fear, or might have been something closer to gratitude, though it passed too quickly for Elena to trust what she had seen. "Where was the Beta Patrol?" he demanded, turning sharply toward his second-in-command. "They should have caught this at the tree line before it ever reached the gate." "They were reassigned to the northern border this morning," Elena answered quietly. "You approved the change yourself, 3 days ago, when the scouting reports came in about Blackthorn movement." He said nothing to that. He simply gave orders, sharp and precise, for the body to be removed, the gate reinforced, and the patrol recalled by first light. Then, as though Elena were no more remarkable in that moment than the stone wall behind her, he turned and walked toward his advisors to begin discussing border security, leaving her standing alone, with a bloodied sleeve, and a chest full of something that felt dangerously close to grief, for a thing that had never even had the chance to begin. This was the shape her life had taken. 9 years of showing up exactly when she was needed, and 9 years of being seen only for the function she served rather than the woman standing behind it. She had come to the Ashwood pack at 16, thin and hollow-eyed, carrying nothing but the ache of a family she had lost in a single terrible night she rarely allowed herself to remember in detail. Damien's mother, the old Luna, had found her half-starved on the edge of pack territory and had done what few alphas would have bothered to do. She had taken her in, fed her, and slowly, patiently, taught her how to become someone strong enough to survive whatever came next. Elena had repaid that kindness the only way she knew how. She learned everything the old Luna offered to teach her, absorbing lessons in household management, negotiation, self-defense, and quiet leadership, with the desperate hunger of a girl who understood, deep in her bones, what it meant to have nothing and no one. When the old Luna died 3 years later, taken suddenly by an illness that no healer could explain, it was 17-year-old Elena who quietly stepped in to keep the pack house from falling into chaos during the worst grief of Damien's young life. She had watched him since that terrible season, watched him transform from a devastated boy barely equipped to hold a pack together into the most formidable alpha king the Northern Territories had seen in a generation. She had watched him negotiate treaties that stopped wars before the first drop of blood was spilled, watched him command respect from allies and fear from rivals, with nothing more than the steady authority of his voice, watched him grow into exactly the kind of leader his mother had always believed he could become. And through every single year of that transformation, she had loved him quietly, the way a person might love a mountain from the base of it, without any real expectation that the mountain would ever notice her standing there. She had never once told him. It had seemed, for a very long time, like the safest secret a person could carry, because a feeling kept entirely to yourself cannot be laughed at, cannot be dismissed, cannot be handed back to you broken. She had memorized the low rasp of his voice on the nights exhaustion wore through his composure. She had learned the particular crease that formed between his eyebrows whenever worry pressed at him, though he refused to voice it aloud. She had turned away 2 respectable offers of courtship from neighboring packs over the years, quietly, without ever explaining why, because the thought of building a life with anyone who was not Damien felt like agreeing to live inside a smaller, dimmer version of everything she actually wanted. She had told herself, for 9 long years, that this arrangement was enough, that being trusted with his household, his correspondence, his most private worries, was its own form of closeness, even if it was never quite the closeness her heart truly wanted. That evening, once the blood had been scrubbed from the stone path and the pack house had settled back into its familiar late-night quiet, Elena carried a tray of ginger tea up to Damien's study, the same way she had done 1,000 times before, because he had mentioned once, years ago, that the drink helped settle him after a difficult day, and she had never once forgotten it, even though he clearly had. She knocked twice and entered at his distracted grunt of permission. He was hunched over a map of the northern border, marking troop positions with small red pins, his focus so complete that he did not look up when she set the tray beside his elbow. "Leave it there," he said, already reaching for the cup without truly registering who had brought it. She lingered half a second longer than necessary, the way she always did, hoping, foolishly, for some small flicker of acknowledgement. It did not come. She turned to go. "Elena." Her heart leapt, absurdly, the way it always did whenever he said her name aloud. She turned back to face him. "The rogue tonight. Did you catch any scent on him? Anything that might tell us who sent him across our border? Not are you all right, not thank you for saving my family. Simply information. Extracted with the same crisp efficiency he extracted information from everyone who worked beneath him." "Blackthorn," she said quietly. Faint, but unmistakable. His expression darkened immediately, all thought of her apparently forgotten in favor of the larger threat. "That's the 3rd incursion this season." "Yes. Thank you," he said finally, though the words landed more like a dismissal than gratitude ever could. "That will be all." Elena returned to the small room she had occupied at the end of the east corridor, since she was 16 years old, and sat on the edge of her narrow bed, staring down at hands still faintly stained along the knuckles, no matter how thoroughly she had scrubbed them in the wash basin. She thought of the way Damien's gaze had swept past her in the courtyard, assessing, calculating, already moving toward the next threat on his endless mental list. She thought of how many times over 9 long years she had hoped, quietly and against her better judgment, that one day he might finally look at her with the same warmth he reserved for his most trusted advisors, and how that hope had never once been rewarded with anything more than efficient gratitude. Sleep did not come easily that night. When it finally did, she dreamed, as she often did, of a different life entirely, one where she had never been found half-starved on the edge of Ashwood territory, one where she had grown up somewhere ordinary, and fallen in love with someone equally ordinary, someone who might have simply looked at her the way she had always longed to be looked at. In the dream there was no Alpha King, no endless silent devotion stretching across 9 patient years, only a small, warm, unremarkable happiness she had never once allowed herself to fully imagine while awake. She woke before dawn, as she always did, and began her day exactly as she had begun nearly 3,000 mornings before it. She checked the kitchen staff's preparations, reviewed the household accounts with her usual careful eye, and laid out Damien's correspondence in order of urgency, anticipating his priorities before he had even opened his study door. She moved through the pack house like a quiet current running beneath still water, essential and entirely unseen, and she told herself, as she always told herself, that this quiet usefulness was enough to build a life around. But something had shifted the night before, standing in that courtyard with blood on her sleeve, and Explain ringing coldly in her ears, and though she did not yet have words for what had cracked open inside her, she felt it humming beneath her ribs, all through the following day, low and persistent, like the first tremor, before an earthquake finally breaks the surface. At midday, she was summoned again to Damien's study. She expected another list of tasks, another schedule to rearrange around his shifting priorities, Instead, she found him standing at the window overlooking the training grounds, arms crossed, watching a fresh group of she-wolves being assessed for the honor guard with the distant, calculating look he wore whenever he was weighing a significant decision. "I have decided," he said, without turning to face her, "to formally announce my search for Aluna." The words landed like a physical blow, though 9 years of practice kept her face perfectly still. "The Blackthorn incursions make it clear we need a stronger alliance in the north," he continued, still gazing out over the training grounds as though the matter were already settled in his mind. "Reyna, the eldest daughter of the Larkspur pack, has expressed interest. Her family controls 3 critical trade routes and commands a formidable defense force. It would be a strategically sound match, one that could secure our northern border for a generation." "I see," Alena said, and her voice did not waver, though everything beneath her ribs did. "I want you to arrange a formal reception for her upcoming visit. Spare no expense. This alliance could reshape the entire balance of power in the north. Of course." He finally turned to look at her then, and for one brief, fragile moment, something in his expression seemed to search her face, as though checking for some reaction she was careful never to give him. Whatever he was looking for, he did not find it, and a moment later he simply nodded, apparently satisfied, and returned his attention to the papers scattered across his desk. "That will be all, Alena." She left the study with her spine held perfectly straight, her hands entirely steady, and it was not until she reached the privacy of her own small room that she finally allowed herself to sit down on the edge of the bed and press one palm flat against her chest, as though she might physically hold together whatever had just quietly come loose inside her. 9 years, she thought, staring at the wall without truly seeing it. 9 years of silence. 9 years of small, unnoticed kindnesses. 9 years of loving a man who had come to see her as furniture, as staff, as a reliable and useful fixture within his household, rather than as a woman who had given him nearly everything she had to give. And now he stood in his study speaking of finding Aluna as though the word itself carried no weight at all, as though it could not possibly cut through 9 years of careful, patient devotion like a blade through unguarded flesh. She thought of the rogue's blood on her sleeve, of Damien's cold explain, of the way his thank you the night before had sounded more like closing a transaction than expressing genuine gratitude. She thought of every one of the 9 birthdays he had let pass unnoticed, each one arriving and departing without so much as a passing mention, though she always ensured his own birthday was marked with his favorite meal, always found some quiet way to celebrate the day, even though he had never once noticed the careful pattern of her devotion. For the first time in 9 years, the patient, hopeful part of her that had always whispered, "Wait, be patient, he will see you eventually," fell completely silent. And in its place, something new began to rise. Something that did not ask permission from anyone. Something that sounded, for the very first time in 9 long years, less like hope and more like resolve. She did not yet know it, sitting there in the fading afternoon light with her stained hands folded quietly in her lap. But the woman who would walk away from Ashwood in a matter of weeks had already begun to take shape inside her, slowly, the way all her most important decisions had always taken shape, without fanfare, without announcement, simply a steady and certain turning, deep beneath the surface, toward a shore Damien could not yet see coming. That evening she attended the formal packed dinner exactly as she always did, standing near the wall alongside the other senior staff, watching Damien receive reports from his advisors, laugh easily at some remark from his second-in-command, move through the crowded hall with the effortless authority of a man who had never once had to wonder whether anyone truly saw him. She watched him the way she had watched him for 9 years, and for the very first time, the watching did not feel like devotion at all. It felt like exhaustion, bone deep, and finally impossible to ignore. Later, alone in her room, she pulled a small wooden box from beneath her bed, the same box that held the few precious things she had carried with her, from the life she had lost before Ashwood, before Damien, before 9 years of careful silence had slowly reshaped her into someone who had nearly forgotten what it felt like to want something purely for herself. She looked at the faded photograph of her parents, at the small silver ring that had belonged to her mother, at the worn letter the old Luna had written her on the very day she was formally welcomed into the pack. "You have a fire in you, Alena," the letter read. "One that will serve you well if you never let anyone convince you to put it out." She had read those words 100 times over the years, always with a quiet, familiar ache, because she understood, in her own private way, that she had allowed that fire to dim considerably over 9 years of patient service. She had banked it down so carefully, for so long, in service of a love that had never once asked her to make herself smaller. Yet somehow, she had made herself smaller anyway, piece by piece, year by year, without ever quite noticing, until tonight. Not anymore, she thought, closing the lid of the box gently, closing her eyes, feeling something settle deep inside her chest that felt, unexpectedly, almost like peace. Down the hall she could still hear the low murmur of Damien's voice, discussing border strategy with his advisors, could hear the occasional rumble of easy laughter, could hear the sound of a life that had never truly made room for her, no matter how much careful room she had spent 9 years making for it. For 9 years, she had loved him in silence. Tonight, for the very first time, that silence began to feel less like devotion, and more like a closed door finally beginning to open. And Elena, quietly, deliberately, allowed herself to imagine, for the first time in years, exactly what might be waiting for her on the other side of it. She did not sleep that night either, not really. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling of the small room that had been hers for 9 long years, turning the shape of her future over in her mind the way she turned over every important decision, carefully, methodically, without haste. She thought of the small, steady savings she had accumulated over nearly a decade of modest wages, rarely spent because she had rarely allowed herself anything beyond the basic necessities of a life devoted almost entirely to someone else's needs. She thought of the neutral territories she had heard traveling merchants speak of over the years, places where packs did not hold the same rigid hierarchies, where a capable woman, with sharp instincts and years of hard-won discipline, might find somewhere that valued her for who she was, rather than simply for what she could do for someone else. The thought frightened her more than she wanted to admit. 9 years was a long time to build an entire life around another person, and the idea of stepping away from everything familiar, everything safe, felt uncomfortably close to standing at the edge of a cliff, in complete darkness, with no way of knowing what waited below. But beneath that fear, quietly, persistently, there was something else too, something that felt strangely like relief, the particular relief that comes from finally setting down a weight carried for so long that you have almost forgotten what it feels like to walk without it pressing against your shoulders. By the time the first gray light of dawn crept through her narrow window, Elena understood, with a clarity that startled her, that something inside her had already decided, long before her conscious mind had caught up to the decision. She was not simply upset. She was not simply hurt by one careless announcement in a crowded study. She had reached, quietly and without any single dramatic moment, the very end of 9 years of patient waiting, and there was no version of tomorrow, or the day after that, in which she could imagine continuing to wait any longer. She rose before the rest of the household stirred, dressed in her usual staff uniform, and began her morning duties exactly as she always did, giving no outward sign whatsoever of the quiet, seismic shift that had taken place inside her overnight. She reviewed the accounts. She laid out correspondence in careful order of priority, and beneath every single practiced familiar motion, a new and unfamiliar resolve continued to build, steady and unshakable, like the tide slowly rising beneath a calm and deceptively still surface. 9 years of silence had brought her here, to this precise moment, standing in the quiet kitchen of the only home she had known since she was 16 years old, watching the sun rise over ground she had walked 10,000 times, understanding, with complete and sudden certainty, that whatever came next, she would not spend another 9 years exactly the same way she had spent the last 9, invisible, patient, and quietly, endlessly waiting for a man who had never once thought to truly look. The morning after Damien announced his search for Eluna, Elena rose before dawn and began organizing the reception for Reyna of the Larkspur pack with the same steady precision she brought to every task, though her hands trembled faintly as she wrote out the guest list at her small desk. She had learned long ago how to separate her private feelings from her professional duties. It was a skill the old Luna had taught her, without ever naming it directly, simply through quiet example, through the graceful way she had continued running the pack house, even in the raw months following the loss of her own mate. Elena had watched and absorbed that lesson, the way she absorbed nearly everything, quietly, thoroughly, until it became as natural to her as breathing. So she planned the reception with meticulous care. She selected the finest linens for the long dining hall, arranged for musicians from the Southern Territories known for their exceptional skill, and coordinated carefully with the kitchen staff to prepare a menu that would honor both packs' traditions in equal measure. She did all of this with the same calm efficiency Damien had long come to expect from her, and if anyone noticed the new shadows beneath her eyes, or the way her smile no longer quite reached them, no one dared to say so aloud. Except for Marla. Marla had worked in the Ashwood kitchens for over 20 years, since long before Damien was even born, and she possessed a particular gift for noticing things that others tended to overlook entirely. She found Elena late one afternoon, sitting alone in the pantry, a list of ingredients resting forgotten in her lap, her eyes fixed on some middle distance that held nothing at all. "You have been different this week," Marla said, setting down a basket of fresh herbs and studying Elena with the frank, unguarded concern of someone who had known her since she was a frightened 16-year-old girl. "Ever since the Alpha announced this business about finding Eluna." "I am the same as I always am," Elena said, though even to her own ears, the words sounded hollow and unconvincing. Marla settled into the chair across from her, wiping her hands slowly on her apron. "Elena, I have known you for 9 years. I watched you grow from a girl who flinched at raised voices into a woman who now runs this entire household without ever breaking a sweat. I believe I have earned the right to notice when something is deeply wrong." Elena set her forgotten list aside. For a long, heavy moment, she said nothing at all, because giving voice to the truth would make it undeniably real, and some stubborn, protective part of her still wanted desperately to guard the secret she had carried alone for so long. But Marla's eyes remained kind, patient, and tired, in a way that spoke of genuine care rather than idle curiosity, and Elena had spent 9 long years without confiding in a single living soul. Suddenly the accumulated weight of that silence felt like far more than she could bear to carry alone for even one more day. "I love him," she finally said, quietly. "I have loved him since I was 17 years old. I have never once told him, and I never intended to. And now he stands in his study, speaking of finding Eluna, as though the word means absolutely nothing to me at all." Marla did not appear surprised by the confession. If anything, her expression suggested a suspicion she had privately carried for years had finally been confirmed beyond any doubt. "I wondered," she said gently, "the way you never once forget his birthday, though he has never remembered yours. The way you always seem to know exactly what he needs before he even thinks to ask for it. I wondered, child. But it was never truly my place to say anything, until you were ready to say it yourself." "It hardly matters now," Elena said, her voice quiet but steady. "He intends to marry someone else, someone strategic. Someone who controls trade routes and commands a defense force. That is what genuinely matters to him. Alliances, borders, the steady accumulation of power. Not," she stopped herself before the words could fully form, because saying them aloud felt uncomfortably close to admitting a defeat she was not yet prepared to name. Marla reached across the small table and took Elena's hand in hers, an unusually tender gesture from a woman who was not naturally given to overt displays of affection. "You have given this entire pack 9 years of your life, child. 9 years of unwavering loyalty, of quiet sacrifice, of love that was never once asked for and never once properly returned. I have watched you give it all, year after year, and I have said nothing, because I foolishly believed a man as genuinely intelligent as Damien would eventually open his eyes and truly see you." "He hasn't," Elena said simply, the words landing between them like small stones. "No," Marla agreed softly, her thumb tracing a gentle, comforting circle across the back of Elena's hand. "He hasn't." They sat together in companionable silence for a long moment, the accumulated weight of 9 years settling between them, like fine dust caught in the late afternoon light streaming through the pantry window. "What will you do?" Marla finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Elena considered the question carefully, turning it over in her mind, the way she turned over every genuinely important decision, slowly, methodically, without allowing herself to rush toward an answer she was not yet ready to give. "I honestly do not know yet," she admitted. "But I know, with complete certainty, that I cannot stand in that hall and quietly watch him court another woman, while I personally arranged the flowers for their wedding celebration. That much, at least, I know for certain." Marla squeezed her hand once more, before finally releasing it. "Then trust yourself to find your own answer, in your own time. You have always been far wiser than you give yourself credit for being, Elena. You always have been, since the very first day you arrived here." That night, Elena lay awake, long after the pack house had settled into complete quiet, staring up at the ceiling of the small room that had been hers for 9 years, and she allowed herself, for the very first time, to genuinely imagine a life that existed entirely beyond the walls of Ashwood. She thought of her modest but steady savings, accumulated patiently over the years, perhaps enough to secure a small room somewhere, and slowly begin building something entirely new for herself. She thought of the neutral territories to the south, where packs did not enforce the same rigid, unforgiving hierarchies, where a woman possessing her particular discipline, her sharp intelligence, her hard-won skills, might finally find a place that genuinely valued her for herself, rather than merely for her usefulness to someone else's ambitions. The thought frightened her considerably. 9 years was a substantial portion of a life to build entirely around another person, and the idea of stepping away from everything familiar and safe felt uncomfortably like standing at the very edge of a steep cliff in complete darkness. But beneath that fear, there remained something else too, something that felt strangely close to relief, the particular relief that comes from finally releasing a burden carried for so long you had genuinely forgotten what it felt like to walk without its considerable weight. Over the following days, Raina of the Larkspur pack arrived for her carefully arranged formal visit, and Elena, ever faithful to her duty, oversaw every single detail of the reception with her usual flawless precision, giving no outward indication whatsoever of the quiet turmoil steadily building beneath her calm exterior. She watched from the edges of the crowded hall as Damien greeted Raina with careful, measured courtesy, watched the two of them walk together through the gardens in the soft afternoon light, watched him laugh, genuinely and easily, at something clever Raina had said, a real laugh, the unguarded kind Elena had rarely heard him offer to anyone, let alone to herself. It should have hurt considerably more than it actually did. Perhaps, Elena thought, watching the two of them from a careful distance, some quiet part of her had already begun letting go, even before she had consciously decided to do so. Raina proved to be, by every reasonable measure, a genuinely impressive woman. Sharp-witted, self-assured, and clearly capable of leading a pack entirely in her own right. She was never unkind to the household staff, and she treated Elena with polite, genuine respect whenever their paths happened to cross, which made it considerably harder, in certain ways, to resent her for anything at all. This was never truly a story about a villain. Raina had done absolutely nothing wrong. She was simply a capable woman who had been offered a strategic alliance and possessed the good sense to consider it with appropriate seriousness. The real problem, Elena finally understood, with startling clarity, one particular evening, as she watched Damien escort Raina in to dinner, had never truly been about Raina at all. The problem had always been 9 long years of silence, 9 years of devotion that had never once been properly acknowledged, 9 years spent making herself small and infinitely patient in the desperate hope that patience alone would eventually be rewarded with something real. It would not be rewarded. She understood that now with a certainty that felt strangely peaceful in its own quiet finality. 3 days into Raina's extended visit, Damien summoned Elena to his study late one evening, long after most of the pack house had already retired for the night. She arrived to find him alone, an untouched glass of wine sitting forgotten on his desk, his expression unusually thoughtful and contemplative. "The negotiations with Raina's father are proceeding well," he said, without any real preamble, as he so often did. "Her pack intends to formally propose the alliance within the coming month, contingent upon an appropriate courtship period." "That is good news," Elena said, and meant it, in the strange, hollow way a person can genuinely mean something that also feels, simultaneously, like a small and private death. Damien studied her for a long moment, his gaze uncharacteristically searching, uncharacteristically direct. "You have been noticeably quiet these past several days." "I have simply been occupied with the reception preparations." "That is not entirely what I mean." He set down his pen, folding his hands together in a gesture she had rarely witnessed from him before, a gesture that suggested, for once, he was choosing his words with genuine care, rather than his usual practiced efficiency. You have served this pack, this family, longer than nearly anyone else currently within these walls. My mother trusted you completely, without reservation, and I have come to rely on you considerably more than I believe I have ever properly acknowledged, even to myself. For one wild, foolish moment, Elena's heart leapt painfully, some small and stubborn ember of hope flaring back to life despite every rational reason it had to remain extinguished. I want you to remain in your current position through the coming transition, he continued. Once Reina formally joins the household as Luna, I understand that changes in leadership can prove genuinely difficult for staff, and I want you to know clearly that your place here remains entirely secure. The fragile hope died as quickly as it had risen, replaced almost instantly by a strange, cold clarity that settled over her like winter frost. He was not asking her to remain, because he genuinely needed her presence in his life. He was simply reassuring her, the way one reassures any loyal and valuable employee, that her position remained safe and unthreatened. 9 years of devoted love, and this was the closest he had ever come to acknowledging what she truly meant to him. Nothing more than a guarantee of continued employment. Thank you, Elena said, her voice perfectly and painfully steady, though something deep inside her had gone very quiet and very still, like the tense moment before a great storm finally breaks. I sincerely appreciate that reassurance. That will be all. She left his study that night and walked slowly back toward her own small room, and along the way, she paused at the tall window overlooking the eastern gardens, where the moon hung low and silver above the dark trees. She stood there for a long, quiet moment, gazing out at grounds she had walked 1,000 times before, at the pack house that had served as the only true home she had known for 9 full years, and she felt, with a calm certainty that genuinely surprised her, that she had finally arrived at her answer. She would not remain to watch him build an entire life alongside someone else, arranging flowers for a wedding that would confirm, once and for all, that 9 years of silent devotion had earned her nothing more than the modest security of a servant's steady position. She had given this pack her unwavering loyalty, her considerable skill, her quiet and unshakable love, and she had received, in careful return, precisely what she probably should have expected all along: gratitude that never quite transformed into genuine recognition, and recognition that never quite transformed into love. It was enough. It had to become enough, because she genuinely could not survive giving away any more of herself than she already had. That night, for the very first time in 9 long years, Elena began, quietly and methodically, to plan the shape of her eventual departure, turning over every practical detail, with the same careful precision she had always brought to every important decision in her carefully guarded life. Elena's plan began, as all her plans did, with a simple written list. She sat at her small desk late at night, once the pack house had fallen into complete silence, and even the guards on the outer wall had settled into the slow, familiar rhythm of their watch, and she wrote out everything she believed she would need. A place to travel toward, enough carefully saved money to survive until she secured new work, a quiet way to leave entirely unnoticed, because a woman who had spent 9 full years learning to move unseen through a pack house understood, better than most, exactly how to disappear when the moment finally demanded it of her. The neutral territory of Fairhollow lay 2 full days of travel to the south, a settlement belonging to no single dominant pack, where wolves and even a modest number of humans lived peacefully side by side, under a rotating council system, rather than beneath a single alpha's inherited rule. Elena had first heard of the place years earlier, from traveling merchants passing through Ashwood, and had filed the small piece of information away carefully, the way she filed away nearly everything potentially useful, never once imagining she would eventually need it for herself. She possessed modest but genuinely steady savings, accumulated patiently across 9 years, because she had rarely found much reason to spend her small wages on anything beyond the barest necessities. She possessed skills that would prove valuable nearly anywhere. She could manage an entire household, balance complex accounts, train new staff from the ground up, negotiate confidently with visiting merchants, and defend herself capably if the need genuinely arose, as she had already proven decisively with the rogue at the eastern gate. She was not, by any honest measure, without genuine value. She had simply spent 9 years pouring the entirety of that value into a man who had never once thought to seriously ask what she herself might need in fair return. The most difficult part of the entire plan was not the practical logistics. It was finding the courage to tell Marla. She found the older woman in the kitchen on a quiet afternoon, kneading bread dough with the same steady, practiced rhythm she had maintained for over 20 years, and Elena joined her, working alongside her in comfortable silence for a while, before finally speaking the words aloud. "I am leaving," she said quietly, "after the formal alliance ceremony concludes next month. I have considered this decision very carefully, and I sincerely believe it is the right choice for me." Marla's hands stilled against the dough, though she did not look up immediately. When she finally did, her eyes were noticeably wet, though her voice remained remarkably steady. "I wondered whether it might eventually come to this. I cannot remain here and watch him marry her, Marla. I cannot spend the remaining years of my life arranging flowers for a happiness that was never intended to include me in any meaningful way." "No," Marla agreed softly. "I do not suppose you truly can." She wiped her flour-dusted hands on her apron and reached out to gently cup Elena's face, the tender gesture of a woman who might have offered the same comfort to a daughter of her own. "You have given this pack absolutely everything, Elena. Your loyalty, your considerable strength, your quiet love, even when none of it was ever properly returned to you in kind. You do not owe this family a single additional day of patient silence." Elena felt tears prick sharply at the corners of her eyes, the first she had allowed herself in many days. "I am genuinely frightened," she admitted quietly. "I have lived here since I was 16 years old. I honestly do not know who I might become outside these familiar walls." "You are Elena," Marla said firmly, without a moment's hesitation. "You were Elena long before this pack ever took you in, and you will remain Elena long after you eventually leave it behind. This place did not create your strength, child. You were always strong. It simply provided you with somewhere to prove that strength existed." They embraced for a long moment, and when they finally separated, Marla wiped at her damp eyes and straightened her apron with brisk, practical determination. "I will help you, of course, in whatever way you need. You have only to ask." Over the following 2 weeks, Elena moved through her daily duties with practiced, outward calm, giving no visible sign of the quiet decision steadily taking shape beneath her composed surface. She continued overseeing preparations for the formal alliance ceremony between Damien and Reina, continued managing the household with her usual flawless precision, continued remembering small, thoughtful details about Damien's preferences that he himself had long since forgotten he had ever mentioned aloud. If anything, she threw herself even more deeply into her work than usual, because it proved considerably easier to bury the growing ache of leaving beneath the familiar comfort of routine tasks. She began, carefully and quietly, preparing for her eventual departure. She sold a handful of small personal possessions to a traveling merchant who visited the pack house monthly, careful never to sell anything that might be noticed missing, or that might raise unwanted questions. She secured a proper travel permit through a beta named Corwin, an old friend from her earliest years in the pack who had always treated her with genuine quiet kindness, and asked no probing questions when she requested his assistance without offering any real explanation. She packed a single modest bag containing only the essentials, a change of practical clothing, her small accumulated savings, the wooden box holding her mother's ring, and the old Luna's cherished letter, and very little else besides. 9 years of an entire life, and it all fit easily into a bag she could carry comfortably on her own back. The hardest moments, by far, were the small and unexpected ones, passing Damien in a narrow hallway and feeling the familiar, persistent ache of loving someone who genuinely did not see her. Watching him carefully review the guest list for the alliance ceremony and quietly note that Reina's favorite flowers should be prominently featured throughout the hall, a level of thoughtful attentiveness he had never once shown toward Elena across 9 full years. Overhearing him mention, in a casual, offhand way, that he sincerely hoped the ceremony might take place before the first winter frost arrived, already planning an entire future that clearly held no place within it for her. She did not resent him for any of it, not truly, not in her heart. That was the strange, complicated truth of loving someone faithfully for 9 years. Even now, even as she quietly prepared to leave everything behind, some stubborn part of her still genuinely wanted good things for him, still sincerely hoped Reina might make him happy, still could not quite bring herself to hate a man who had simply never once known what he was failing to see standing right in front of him. But wanting good things for him did not mean she was obligated to remain and personally watch it all unfold. 3 days before the formal alliance ceremony, Elena finished the last of her careful preparations. She arranged to have her final month's wages paid slightly early, citing a fabricated need to send money to a distant relative, a small lie that felt strange and unfamiliar in her mouth after 9 years of scrupulous honesty, but one she deemed necessary under the circumstances. She said her private, careful goodbyes to the handful of household staff she had genuinely grown close to over the years, taking great care to frame each farewell as an ordinary parting, rather than the final one it truly was, so as not to raise any premature suspicion before she was fully ready to leave. Marla remained the only person who knew the complete truth, and even she did not know the exact night Elena finally intended to go. On that final evening, Elena stood at her window for a long time, gazing out over the grounds of the only home she had genuinely known for 9 full years. She thought of the frightened 16-year-old girl who had first arrived here broken and afraid, and of the steady, capable, quietly formidable woman she had gradually become in all the years since. She thought of the old Luna's careful words, "The fire in you, one that will serve you well if you never let anyone convince you to put it out," and she felt, for the first time in a very long while, that she was finally honoring them completely. She did not compose Damien a long letter explaining the full weight of her feelings, though she seriously considered it. In the end, she decided firmly against it. 9 years of careful silence had taught her that words, for Damien, mattered considerably less than concrete actions, and she suspected a heartfelt letter explaining her love would likely be received as simply one more piece of information to be filed away and eventually forgotten, rather than as the genuine confession it truly was. Instead, she composed a short, formal note of resignation, citing vague personal reasons, thanking the pack sincerely for 9 years of genuine opportunity, and wishing Damien well in his future as Alpha, and, soon enough, as a married man. It was not everything she truly felt. It was not even a small fraction of everything she genuinely felt, but it was sufficient to close the door quietly behind her, without slamming it forcefully, and that, she finally decided, was the right and dignified way to leave. She placed the note carefully on the desk in her room, where it would certainly be found, and folded her staff uniform neatly on the bed beside it, a small, quiet symbol of a role she was formally and deliberately stepping away from. Then she picked up her single modest bag, slipped silently out through the servants' entrance in the pale gray darkness before dawn, and walked, for the first time in 9 full years, away from the Ashwood pack house, without once looking back over her shoulder. Corwin waited for her at the eastern gate exactly as arranged, his expression solemn but understanding, as he handed her the travel permit and a small pouch of additional supplies he had quietly insisted on providing without being asked. "You could still change your mind," he said quietly, though his voice carried no real expectation that she would. "I know," Elena said simply, "but I will not." He nodded, respecting her firm decision, without any further argument, and opened the gate, just wide enough for her to slip through into the pale gray light of early dawn. "Fairhollow is a genuinely good place," he added. "I have family living there. I will send word ahead, if you would like, so you have somewhere safe waiting when you first arrive. Thank you, Corwin, for everything you have done." She walked south along the tree line as the sun slowly began to rise behind her, the pack house steadily growing smaller and smaller, until the surrounding trees finally swallowed it entirely from view. She did not cry, though she had genuinely expected she might. Instead, she felt something entirely unexpected settle over her, with each determined step she took further away from 9 years of silence. A strange, quiet lightness, as though she had been carrying an enormous, invisible weight for so many years that she had nearly forgotten what it felt like to walk freely without it. By the time the sun had fully risen above the horizon, Elena stood miles away from the only home she had known since she was 16 years old, walking steadily toward a future that belonged entirely and completely to herself for the first time in 9 full years. Though the road ahead remained genuinely uncertain, though she did not yet know precisely what awaited her in Fairhollow, she felt, for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, that she was finally walking toward something real, rather than simply waiting, endlessly and patiently, for someone who would never truly come. Behind her, back within the packhouse she had just left forever, the sun would soon rise over an empty room, a neatly folded uniform, and a short, formal note that would irrevocably change everything Damien believed he understood about the last 9 years of his entire life. Damien noticed Elena's absence for the very first time at breakfast, when his tea arrived lukewarm and improperly seasoned, prepared by a kitchen assistant who did not know he preferred it steeped for exactly 4 minutes, with precisely 1 spoon of honey stirred in afterward. He frowned faintly at the cup, set it aside without further comment, and moved forward with his usual morning routine, assuming Elena had simply been pulled away into some other pressing task connected to the approaching alliance ceremony. It was not until mid-morning, when he needed the finalized guest list for the ceremony and found it entirely absent from his desk, that genuine irritation began to creep steadily into his otherwise focused morning. "Where is Elena?" he asked Corwin, who happened to be passing through the main hall carrying a report on recent border patrols. Corwin's expression, had Damien been paying closer attention in that moment, might have revealed something significant. But Damien was not paying close attention, not to Corwin's carefully guarded face, not to anything beyond the immediate inconvenience of a missing guest list sitting nowhere on his desk. "I believe she had some personal matters requiring her attention this morning," Corwin said carefully, choosing his words with evident caution. "Personal matters," Damien repeated, faintly incredulous, as though the very concept of Elena having personal matters significant enough to interfere with her duties had genuinely never once occurred to him in 9 full years. "Find her, and inform her that I require the completed guest list by this afternoon at the latest." Corwin nodded and departed, and Damien returned his attention to his waiting correspondence, mildly annoyed but not yet genuinely alarmed. It was not until early afternoon, when a young kitchen maid knocked timidly on his study door carrying a folded piece of parchment alongside a neatly pressed staff uniform, that the entire shape of the day began, quite suddenly, to shift beneath him. "What exactly is this?" Damien asked, accepting the folded parchment from her trembling hands. "It was found on Elena's desk, my lord. Marla asked that I personally bring it to you right away." Damien unfolded the parchment carefully, and as he read through its contents, his expression shifted gradually from mild confusion into something considerably harder to properly name. The words themselves were formal and precise, exactly what he might have expected from Elena's careful, practiced hand, and yet the underlying substance of them struck him with an impact he could not immediately begin to understand. "I am writing to formally resign my position within the Ashwood household, effective immediately. After 9 years of dedicated service, I have carefully decided it is time for me to pursue a different path forward. I remain deeply grateful for the many opportunities I was given here, and I sincerely wish the pack, and you personally, every possible happiness in the future ahead. Please do not attempt to locate me. I have made this decision with a genuinely clear mind, and I ask only that it be fully respected. Elena." Damien read the brief note 3 separate times, as though sheer repetition might somehow alter its underlying meaning. "Resigned. Effective immediately. Do not attempt to locate me." "This cannot possibly be right," he said aloud, to no one in particular, and then, considerably louder, "Send for Marla immediately." Marla arrived within only a few minutes, her expression carefully composed and neutral in a way that Damien, even amid his growing distraction, noted was distinctly unusual for her ordinarily open manner. "Where precisely is Elena?" he demanded, his voice sharper than he intended. "Gone, my lord," Marla said simply, without embellishment, exactly as her note already explained. "Gone where, specifically?" She did not say. "You have known her for 9 full years. Surely she told you something of substance." Marla met his gaze steadily, and for the very first time in his memory, Damien saw something in the old cook's expression that looked genuinely close to disappointment, directed squarely at him. "She told me quite enough, my lord, but it is not truly my place to share her private reasons with you. If you sincerely wish to understand why she chose to leave, I would strongly suggest you think very carefully about the last 9 years of her service here, rather than expecting me to explain them away for you." The words landed strangely, uncomfortably, and Damien frowned deeply, turning them over slowly in his mind, even as he dismissed Marla with an impatient wave of his hand, irritation flaring sharply at what he initially perceived as unwarranted insubordination. He would address that particular matter later. For the moment, There remained a far more immediate and pressing problem. The alliance ceremony was scheduled in exactly 3 days. Half the necessary arrangements remained frustratingly incomplete, and the single person who could have effortlessly managed the resulting chaos had simply, inexplicably, vanished without a trace. He spent the remainder of that day attempting to redistribute Elena's considerable responsibilities among the remaining staff, and it was through that difficult process, more than through anything else, that the true and startling scope of what she had actually managed for 9 years began to fully reveal itself to him. The guest list remained incomplete. The seating arrangements were left entirely unfinished. The ongoing correspondence with the Larkspur Pack's advance party had gone unanswered for 2 full days, because Elena had always personally handled it, and no one else on staff knew the intricate details of the ongoing negotiations. The household accounts, which Damien discovered to his genuine surprise, Elena had been quietly balancing and carefully adjusting for years, without ever once requesting additional compensation for the considerable extra work involved. By evening, Damien sat alone in his study, surrounded by piles of half-finished tasks and steadily mounting frustration, and found himself, for the very first time in longer than he could clearly remember, genuinely and thoroughly unsettled by more than simple inconvenience. It was not merely the practical disruption, though the disruption itself remained entirely real and significant. It was something else entirely, something considerably harder to properly name, a strange and hollow feeling that had begun settling into his chest sometime around mid-afternoon, and had only continued growing steadily heavier as the long day wore relentlessly on. He kept returning, without quite meaning to the persistent image of the neatly folded uniform resting on Elena's abandoned desk, to the careful precision of her familiar handwriting, to the absolute finality contained within, "Please do not attempt to locate me." He told himself repeatedly it was simply the disruption to his carefully maintained schedule. He told himself it was nothing more than frustration at losing a genuinely competent member of his staff at an especially critical moment. He told himself several different things throughout that long, difficult evening, and none of them quite managed to explain the strange, persistent ache that settled firmly beneath his ribs every single time he allowed himself to think of the empty room waiting at the end of the east corridor. He did not sleep well at all that night. He found himself, at various odd hours, remembering small details he had not genuinely thought about in years. Elena's steady, quiet presence at the edge of every important gathering, always watching carefully, always ready to step forward the exact moment she was truly needed. The way she had somehow always known, without ever once being explicitly told, exactly what he needed, before he even fully realized he needed it himself. Tea steeped precisely 4 minutes. Correspondence sorted meticulously by urgency. Difficult guests, seated at a careful, thoughtful distance from one another, before any potential conflicts could even begin to arise. The way she had stood so calmly in the great hall just weeks earlier, blood still fresh on her sleeve from a fight that could easily have cost his young cousin's life, and he had said nothing more meaningful in response than explain, as though her considerable courage were simply one more piece of routine information to be processed and quietly filed away. He rose the following morning, still turning these uncomfortable thoughts over in his mind, and it was over yet another cup of cold, improperly steeped tea, that the first genuine crack of real understanding finally began to open within him, though he did not yet possess adequate words for what it truly meant. The ceremony preparations, meanwhile, continued steadily to fray at every edge. The Larkspur advance party arrived a full day earlier than expected, and without Elena's careful practiced coordination, the entire reception proved disorganized, the guest rooms improperly and hastily prepared, the welcoming feast delayed by nearly 2 full hours due to widespread confusion in the understaffed kitchen. Reyna herself, gracious as always, offered no direct complaint, but Damien caught the faint, assessing look that crossed her sharp eyes as she surveyed the resulting chaos, and he understood, with a genuinely sinking feeling, that his household's competence he had always taken entirely and completely for granted, had apparently walked straight out the door alongside Elena. That evening, as he stood alone on the balcony outside his study, gazing out over the familiar grounds where he had once, many years earlier, watched a frightened 16-year-old girl arrive at the pack house gates, carrying absolutely nothing but the worn clothes on her back, Damien found himself finally asking a question he had genuinely never seriously considered before in 9 full years. What, precisely, had Elena's 9 years of faithful service actually cost her personally. He thought of the respectable suitors she had quietly turned away over the years, without explanation, though he had barely registered any of it at the time beyond a passing, dismissive thought that she simply seemed uninterested in courtship generally. He thought of the countless late nights she had remained within the pack house, managing sudden crises, soothing tensions among the anxious staff, ensuring every single detail of his demanding life ran smoothly, all while he had scarcely thanked her beyond the occasional curt, distracted acknowledgement. He thought of her birthday, and realized, with a sudden jolt of genuine shame, that he did not actually know the specific date, had never once properly celebrated it, had genuinely never once thought to simply ask. 9 years, and he did not even know her birthday. The thought settled heavily in his chest as the evening deepened steadily around him, the training grounds below sitting empty and silent, the pack house behind him, full of unfinished preparations for a marriage that suddenly felt, for reasons he could not yet fully articulate to himself, considerably less certain than it had felt only a week before. He did not yet fully understand the true shape of what he had lost. That deeper understanding would come slowly, painfully, over the difficult days ahead, gradually built from small fragments of half-forgotten memory and the growing, increasingly uncomfortable awareness that a woman who had spent 9 full years quietly holding his entire world together had finally, silently, walked away from all of it, and he had remained far too consumed with his own pressing concerns to notice her leaving until it was already far too late to stop her. For now, standing alone in the steadily cooling evening air, all Damien knew with any real certainty was that something genuinely essential had gone missing from within the Ashwood pack house, and no amount of frantically reorganizing schedules or redistributing tasks among the remaining staff seemed capable of filling the strange, hollow space her absence had left steadily growing behind it. Fair Hollow was nothing whatsoever like Ashwood, and that, Elena decided firmly within her very first hour of arriving, was precisely why it might genuinely work for her. There was no great imposing pack house dominating the settlement's center, no single alpha's authority hanging heavily over every decision made within the community. Instead, Fair Hollow spread out comfortably along a wide river valley, a patchwork collection of homes and small shops and busy workshops belonging equally to wolves and humans alike, governed collectively by a rotating council of elected representatives, rather than by a single inherited bloodline of power. It was noticeably smaller than Ashwood, quieter in certain distinct ways, but it hummed steadily with an entirely different kind of energy, the energy generated by people who had actively chosen to build their lives here rather than simply being born unquestioningly into them. Corwin's extended family, exactly as promised, took Elena in for her first uncertain nights, a warm and refreshingly unassuming household, headed by his older sister, a skilled weaver named Petra, who asked remarkably few questions and offered generous hospitality, without ever expecting anything meaningful in return. Elena spent those first tentative nights in a small guest room, overlooking the wide river, and though genuine sleep did not come easily, there existed a certain quiet peace in simply existing somewhere Damien had never once set foot, somewhere his voice did not echo persistently through every hallway, somewhere she was not, for the first time in 9 full years, defined entirely by her careful proximity to him. Within a single week, she had secured a small room of her own, situated above a busy bakery near the town's central market square, modest but genuinely clean, with one single window that let in soft morning light each day. Within 2 full weeks, she had found steady employment managing the accounts and general household affairs for a prosperous local merchant family known as the Ashfords, work that drew directly upon the very same skills she had spent 9 years carefully honing at Ashwood, though this time, she noted with a strange but genuine sense of vindication, she was paid an entirely fair wage and treated with authentic respect from her very first day on the job. The Ashfords proved to be a genuinely interesting family. Garrett Ashford, the family's patriarch, ran a successful and expanding trading operation that moved valuable goods between the northern packs and the southern human settlements, and his warm wife, Vivian, managed a household of considerable size with a genuine warmth that reminded Elena, in small but meaningful ways, of the old Luna who had first taken her in so many years earlier. Their eldest son, a quiet and genuinely thoughtful man named Callum, who managed the family's extensive ledgers, worked closely alongside Elena, From her very earliest days there, and within their first few weeks working together, she found herself, to her own genuine surprise, thoroughly enjoying his steady, unassuming company. Callum was nothing whatsoever like Damien. Where Damien instinctively commanded the full attention of any room simply by entering it, Callum tended naturally to fade comfortably into the background, considerably more at ease with columns of numbers and careful, quiet observation than with the loud, demanding business of leadership. He was kind in small, wonderfully consistent ways, remembering meaningful details about Elena's genuine preferences within their very first few conversations together, asking after her well-being, not out of mere social obligation, but out of what appeared to be authentic, unforced curiosity. He noticed things about her. He noticed when she seemed genuinely tired, when a particular column of stubborn figures troubled her more than usual, when she grew quiet in a way that clearly suggested something significant was weighing heavily on her private mind. It was strange, Elena thought more than once during those formative early weeks, how much genuinely easier it proved to be truly seen by someone who had never once known her as anything other than herself, someone entirely without 9 accumulated years of careful, patient invisibility to somehow overcome first. She did not share with Callum, or with anyone else in Fairhollow, the complete and painful story of exactly why she had chosen to leave Ashwood behind. She offered only a simple, appropriately general explanation, that she had served a pack in the far north for many years, and had finally decided it was time to build an entirely new life for herself and the people of Fairhollow, respecting the unspoken custom of genuine privacy that seemed woven throughout the settlement, did not press her for any additional details. Slowly, steadily, over the following weeks, Elena began building something that felt, for the very first time in 9 full years, entirely and completely her own. She furnished her small room above the bakery with simple, carefully chosen possessions. A soft woolen blanket, purchased from a bustling market stall. A small collection of books she had always genuinely wanted to read, but had never once found the time for. A wooden box, closely matching the one she had originally carried from Ashwood, in which she slowly began keeping new treasures rather than only cherished old ones. She wrote to Marla exactly once, a carefully worded letter, with no return address included, simply to let her old friend know she had arrived safely and was genuinely doing well. She made no mention whatsoever of Damien, and Marla, in her brief reply delivered discreetly through Corwin's continued correspondence with his sister, did not ask a single question about him either. But even as her promising new life steadily began to take shape around her, Elena found that the deep ache of 9 years did not simply disappear just because she had finally put considerable distance between herself and its original source. There were quiet, unguarded moments, in the early morning hours, before the bakery below her room began its daily labors, or late at night, when the bustling market square outside her window finally fell completely silent, when she found herself thinking of Damien, despite her own considerable, determined efforts not to. She wondered, sometimes, whether the ceremony with Reyna had genuinely proceeded exactly as planned, whether he had noticed her absence at all, beyond the merely practical inconvenience it must have inevitably caused him, whether 9 full years had truly meant as little to him as his persistent silence had always painfully suggested. She told herself these particular thoughts would gradually fade with the steady passage of time, that the deep ache would slowly dull, that eventually she would think of Ashwood and of Damien the way one naturally thinks of a chapter finally closed, rather than a wound still actively healing. And during the busy daylight hours, surrounded by the purposeful rhythm of her genuinely new life, she almost believed it completely. One particular evening, nearly a full month after her initial arrival, Callum found her sitting alone on the small balcony outside her rented room, watching the sunset paint the wide river valley in brilliant shades of gold and soft rose, and he settled comfortably into the chair beside her, without formally asking permission, a small, welcome familiarity that had gradually grown between them over their many weeks of working closely together. "You seem genuinely far away tonight," he observed gently, his tone carrying quiet warmth rather than any invasive curiosity. "I was thinking about the entire life I chose to leave behind," Elena admitted, genuinely surprising herself with her own unexpected honesty. "It is strange. I truly believed leaving would feel exactly like closing a door completely. Some days it genuinely does feel that way. Other days it feels considerably more like the door remains open still, just very far away now. Callum considered her words carefully for a long moment, his thoughtful gaze fixed steadily on the river flowing gently below them. "For whatever it is genuinely worth," he said carefully, "whoever failed to properly recognize your true worth in your previous life made an exceptionally significant mistake. I have known you for only a few short weeks, and even I can already see it quite clearly." Elena felt a genuine warmth spread slowly through her chest that had absolutely nothing to do with the beautiful setting sun, though it remained a considerably gentler, quieter warmth than the fierce, aching love she had carried faithfully for Damien across 9 long years. It was, she realized with quiet clarity, the distinct warmth of being genuinely noticed simply for who she truly was, without requiring 9 years of patient, silent waiting to properly earn it. "Thank you, Callum," she said softly, meaning it completely. "That genuinely means more to me than you could possibly know." They sat together in comfortable, easy silence, as the sun finally dipped entirely below the distant horizon, and though Elena's heart still carried the considerable weight of 9 years of unspoken love, she felt, for the very first time since her arrival in Fairhollow, a genuine flicker of authentic hope that her future might yet hold something considerably more meaningful than simply the absence of her difficult past. She did not yet know that far to the north, within the halls of the Ashwood packhouse, her sudden absence had steadily grown into something the Alpha King could no longer possibly ignore, a hollow, aching space, at the very center of his entire life, that no amount of strategic alliances or careful border negotiations seemed remotely capable of filling. She did not yet know that the careful, hard-won calm she had painstakingly built for herself in Fairhollow was about to be seriously tested by the unexpected arrival of the very man she had spent 9 full years silently loving, and had finally, painfully, taught herself to leave behind for good. For now, she simply watched the very last light of day fade gently over the wide river, and allowed herself, quite cautiously, to imagine a genuine future, built entirely upon her own carefully chosen terms. In the days that followed, Elena's confidence in her new life continued to grow steadily. Vivienne Ashford began including her in small family gatherings, treating her less like hired help, and more like a genuine friend of the household, an experience that felt entirely foreign and remarkably welcome after 9 years of standing quietly at the edges of gatherings, rather than truly belonging within them. Garrett Ashford, impressed by her sharp handling of a particularly difficult trade negotiation with a visiting merchant from the coast, began entrusting her with increasingly significant responsibilities. Responsibilities that came paired with genuine recognition and fair compensation, rather than simply more unacknowledged work. She began, tentatively, to explore Fairhollow beyond her daily routine of work and rest. She discovered a small library maintained collectively by the town council, where she spent quiet evening hours finally reading the books she had never once had time for during her years at Ashwood. She discovered a weekly gathering held in the town square, where residents shared music and simple food and easy conversation, an entirely unfamiliar rhythm of community life that slowly began, week by week, to feel less foreign and considerably more like something she might genuinely belong to. And through it all, in quiet, unguarded moments, she continued to feel the persistent pull of 9 years she could not simply will away, no matter how determined her efforts. But increasingly, alongside that familiar ache, she felt something new growing steadily within her as well, a genuine, hard-won sense that she had made the right decision in finally choosing herself, after 9 long years of choosing everyone and everything else first. The alliance ceremony with Reyna proceeded forward exactly as planned, though it lacked the seamless, effortless grace that Elena's careful hand had always brought to every important event, and Damien found himself, throughout the entire lengthy proceeding, distracted in a way he genuinely could not fully explain, even to himself. Reyna noticed his distraction immediately. She remained far too sharp and perceptive a woman not to notice. On the evening following the ceremony, as the two of them walked together through the eastern gardens, discussing the formal terms of their upcoming courtship period, she suddenly stopped mid-sentence and studied him with a frank, deeply assessing look that reminded him, quite uncomfortably, of a remarkably similar look Elena had once given him, without his ever fully registering it at the time. "You are somewhere else entirely tonight," Reyna observed directly. "You have been, all week long, if I am being completely honest with you. My sincere apologies. Damien said carefully. The recent transition in household staff has proven considerably more disruptive than I initially anticipated it would be. Is that genuinely what is truly troubling you? Raina asked, her tone remaining direct but never unkind. Or is this actually something considerably more personal than mere household staffing issues? Damien opened his mouth to firmly deny it, and found, to his own genuine surprise, that the denial simply would not come to him. He thought instead of Elena's neat, careful handwriting, of the absolute finality contained within her brief note, of the strange hollow feeling that had settled deep into his chest, the exact moment he finally understood she was genuinely, truly gone. I honestly do not fully know, he admitted quietly, which was, he realized with some discomfort, the most completely honest thing he had said aloud in many days. Raina studied him a moment longer in thoughtful silence, then nodded slowly, as though confirming a private suspicion she had already privately formed. This particular alliance was always intended to be primarily strategic in nature, Damien. I genuinely respect you as a leader, and I sincerely believe our two packs would prove considerably stronger united together. But I hold absolutely no interest whatsoever in marrying a man whose thoughts are so clearly and persistently elsewhere. I believe, before we proceed any further together, you genuinely owe it to both of us to first understand exactly what is truly troubling you at your core. Her words, delivered without any real anger or pointed accusation, struck Damien with entirely unexpected force. He had spent his entire adult life making calculated, coldly strategic decisions, carefully weighing alliances and potential threats with practiced precision, and yet here stood Raina, offering him a clarity he had genuinely been unable to find, entirely on his own. That something significant had fundamentally shifted within him, something genuinely important, and it had begun the exact moment Elena walked out through the gates of the Ashwood Packhouse. Over the following difficult days, Damien threw himself deeply into the steadily growing pile of administrative chaos left behind in Elena's sudden wake, and it was through the difficult process of untangling 9 full years of quietly efficient management that the complete picture of exactly what he had genuinely lost finally began to take proper shape in his mind. He discovered, while working painstakingly through the household ledgers, that Elena had personally absorbed the cost of several minor household emergencies over the years, rather than burden the family's overall budget, quietly covering the resulting difference from her own modest wages, without ever once mentioning it to anyone. He discovered that she had personally trained no fewer than 11 separate junior staff members over the years, each one now scattered across various important roles throughout the pack, all of them speaking of her. When Damien finally thought to specifically ask, with a genuine warmth and deep respect that suggested a level of care he had personally never once witnessed her extend toward himself. He spoke at length with the pack's Beta Council, ostensibly to discuss the ongoing border situation with the Blackthorn pack, and found the conversation naturally drifting, more than once, steadily back toward the subject of Elena. One older council member, a gruff and battle-hardened warrior named Ferris, who had faithfully served under Damien's father many years before him, mentioned almost in passing that Elena had once quietly intervened on behalf of a young pack member facing genuinely unjust punishment years earlier, using her close personal relationship with the old Luna to advocate successfully for leniency that had ultimately saved the young wolf's entire standing within the pack. She never once told me that, Damien said, genuinely startled by the revelation. Ferris simply shrugged his broad shoulders. She was never the type to seek personal credit, my lord. She simply did what she genuinely believed was right, and then quietly moved forward without another word. Piece by piece, conversation by revealing conversation, a complete portrait steadily began to emerge of a woman Damien realized, with mounting personal discomfort, he had never truly known, despite 9 full years of her constant, steady presence throughout his entire life. He had known Elena purely as a function, as a reliable and efficient extension of his own personal needs and immediate priorities, but he had genuinely never once, across 9 full years, taken the time to properly understand her as a complete person with her own private history, her own quiet acts of genuine courage and unrecognized kindness, her own personal hopes that existed entirely independent of her considerable usefulness to him. The growing realization sat heavily upon his chest, made considerably heavier still by his growing suspicion, fed directly by Marla's pointed comment about carefully thinking through the last 9 years. that Elena's sudden departure had never truly been about a simple desire for a new career path, but about something considerably more deeply personal, something Damien had somehow managed to remain entirely and completely blind to for far too long. He found himself, late one night nearly 2 full weeks after Elena's initial disappearance, standing alone within the small room at the end of the east corridor that had faithfully served as hers for 9 full years, now stripped almost entirely bare of her genuine presence save for a few small, overlooked items. A well-worn book on household management she had clearly studied quite extensively over the years, and a single small dried flower, pressed carefully between its yellowed pages, faded considerably with age, but still lovingly preserved. He picked up the small dried flower with careful hands, turning it over slowly, and something about its careful, deliberate preservation struck him with sudden, entirely unexpected force. He remembered then, with startling and sudden clarity, a particular moment from many years earlier that he had entirely forgotten until this exact instant. He had been perhaps 23 years old, newly grieving the devastating loss of his mother, walking alone through the eastern gardens during a particularly difficult night, and he had found Elena there too, sitting quietly beneath an old flowering tree, though she had said absolutely nothing at first, had not intruded upon his private grief, had simply remained a quiet, steady presence at a respectful distance, until he was finally ready to speak. When he had finally spoken, haltingly and with considerable difficulty, about his genuine fear that he was not truly ready to lead the pack his mother had left behind him, Elena had listened without a single word of judgment, and at the conclusion of their quiet conversation, she had picked a single flower from the tree above them both, and pressed it gently into his open hand, saying simply, "Your mother genuinely believed in you, and I believe her careful judgment was entirely sound." He had thanked her, distractedly, and moved forward with his considerable grief and mounting responsibilities, never once considering, across all the 9 years since, exactly what that quiet act of genuine comfort might have personally cost a 17-year-old girl, who had already spent so much of her own young life learning to hold other people's pain without complaint or expectation of return. Standing now within her entirely empty room, holding a small dried flower that must have been the exact twin of the one he himself had once carried away, Damien felt something crack open deep within his chest, a slow, dawning understanding of exactly how much he had genuinely failed to see standing right in front of him for 9 complete years. He sat down heavily upon the bare, stripped bed, the small pressed flower still held carefully within his open hand, and allowed himself, for the very first time since Elena's sudden departure, to fully and honestly confront the difficult question he had been quietly circling for many weeks, without quite daring to properly name it aloud. Had Elena genuinely loved him? Had she loved him faithfully for 9 long years, silently and patiently, while he actively built strategic alliances with other women and thanked her? On the rare occasions he even thought to properly thank her at all, with the exact same brisk, efficient courtesy he might have extended to any competent member of his general staff? The difficult question, once genuinely asked, could not simply be unasked again, and once he had finally asked it of himself, Damien found he could no longer possibly avoid the honest answer that had been quietly assembling itself from 9 full years of small, previously overlooked moments, the carefully remembered birthdays that were always exclusively his own, never once hers in return, the comforting ginger tea that appeared without fail on his most genuinely difficult days, the steady, unwavering presence that had quietly shaped the entire architecture of his adult life, without his ever once truly seeing the remarkable woman responsible for building it. Yes, Elena had genuinely loved him. And he, in his considerable blindness, his relentless focus on strategy and duty, and the crushing weight of leadership, had allowed her to love him in complete silence for 9 full years, without ever once giving her sufficient reason to believe that love was truly seen, let alone properly returned in kind. This particular realization did not arrive gently, or with any softness. It arrived instead like a genuine physical blow, sudden and thoroughly disorienting, and Damien sat alone within the empty room for a considerable time afterward, the small pressed flower still cradled carefully within his open palm, feeling, for the very first time in longer than he could clearly remember, genuinely and thoroughly lost within his own life. The following morning, he did not attend the scheduled council meeting. Instead, he remained alone in his private study, reading through years of old correspondence and household records with fresh eyes, searching for every trace of Elena he had previously overlooked. He found her careful handwriting everywhere, once he finally knew to look for it. In the margins of old treaty drafts where she had quietly noted potential complications he had somehow missed entirely. In household ledgers where she had found small, clever ways to save the pack money, without ever once drawing attention to her own resourcefulness. In a dozen small places throughout 9 years of records that told the story of a woman who had given everything of herself, while asking for almost nothing meaningful in return. By the time evening fell once more over Ashwood, Damien understood, with a clarity that felt both painful and strangely necessary, that he could not simply continue forward as though nothing significant had changed. Something fundamental within him had shifted, permanently and completely, and there would be no returning to the man he had been, before he finally opened his eyes to 9 years of blindness. In the weeks that steadily followed his painful realization, Damien became a man entirely consumed by a single, urgent purpose: finding Elena, wherever she had gone. He began, quite carefully, with Marla, approaching her not with the demanding authority he had previously used, but instead with a genuine humility that surprised even himself. He found her working alone in the kitchen late one evening, and this time, rather than sharply ordering her to explain herself, he simply sat down across from her and asked, quietly and sincerely, whether she would help him properly understand exactly what he had failed to see for so long. Marla studied him carefully for a long moment, as though genuinely weighing whether this newfound humility was authentic or simply another form of impatience, dressed in considerably gentler clothing. Whatever she ultimately found reflected in his expression seemed to satisfy her, because she finally set down her work entirely and began to speak. She loved you, my lord, for 9 complete years. Since she was barely more than a frightened child herself, she never once expected anything meaningful from you in return. She never once asked for anything, but she watched you steadily build an entire life that held no genuine place within it for her, and when you finally announced your formal search for Eluna, something within her that had remained patient for 9 long years simply could not remain patient for even one single day longer. Damien absorbed this difficult truth in complete silence, the considerable weight of it settling over him like something physically heavy. Why did she never once tell me directly? Would you genuinely have listened? Marla asked, not unkindly, but with complete directness. 9 years ago, you were a grieving young man, desperately trying to hold together a pack that had just lost its beloved Luna. Would a heartfelt declaration of love from a 16-year-old girl you had taken in, purely as a favor to your mother, have genuinely meant anything to you back then? And in all the years since, has there ever once been a single genuine moment where you paused long enough, amid all your endless strategy and calculated alliances, to truly wonder what Elena herself might have wanted for her own life? The difficult question landed with brutal, undeniable honesty, and Damien found he had absolutely no defense against it whatsoever, because the genuinely truthful answer was no. There had never once been such a moment, not in 9 complete years. I need to find her, he said quietly, with complete conviction. I need to make this right, whatever it takes. Marla's expression softened noticeably, though her eyes remained carefully watchful. That is entirely between you and her, my lord. I will not stand in the way of you seeking her out. But I will tell you this clearly. Elena did not leave lightly, and she will not be won back through grand empty gestures or hollow apologies. If you are truly serious about making this right, you will need to prove, through genuine patience and authentic personal change, that you finally understand exactly what you failed to give her across 9 full years. Damien nodded slowly, fully accepting the considerable weight of her carefully chosen words. Do you know precisely where she went? Marla hesitated visibly, clearly torn between her natural loyalty to Elena's privacy and her genuine belief that Damien's remorse appeared entirely sincere. Finally, after a long moment, she spoke. Corwin personally helped her leave. I believe she traveled south, toward Fair Hollow. His sister lives there, but I would urge considerable caution, my lord. If you choose to go, go with genuine humility, not with your usual authority. Elena has spent 9 full years being seen only for what she could productively do for others. If you arrive there expecting her to simply return home because you have finally noticed her existence, you will only prove definitively that you have learned absolutely nothing at all. Damien left the kitchen that night with Marla's careful warning ringing steadily in his ears, and he spent the following several days in careful, deliberate reflection, forcing himself to confront, honestly, and without any convenient excuse, the full and complete scope of his failures across the past 9 years. He thought of every dismissed thank you, every unremembered birthday, every single moment he had treated Elena's steady presence as merely a fixture of his household, rather than as the deliberate, courageous choice of a woman who had freely given him 9 full years of her life in exchange for a love he had genuinely never once earned. He also, with considerable personal difficulty, held a final honest conversation with Reina, formally ending their courtship period with a sincere apology for the confusion his obviously distracted state had caused her throughout their brief time together. Reina, entirely to her credit, took the disappointing news with genuine grace, rather than any real anger. "I honestly suspected as much," she said simply, without bitterness. "For whatever it may be worth, I sincerely hope you find whatever clarity you are searching for. And I genuinely hope, if you do manage to find her, that you have truly learned what it actually means to see someone completely, rather than simply using them well." Her carefully chosen words, though never unkind, stung with their considerable accuracy, and Damien carried them with him throughout his careful preparations for the coming journey south toward Fairhollow. He did not depart immediately, as his very first instinct genuinely urged him to do. Instead, he forced himself to wait patiently, to spend several more weeks genuinely examining his own considerable failures, and beginning, in small but meaningful ways, the difficult process of authentic change Marla had warned him would prove entirely necessary. He personally thanked every single member of his staff for their individual contributions, something he had genuinely rarely bothered to do before this point. He began carefully keeping a small written record of important dates related to the people around him, determined never again to let 9 full years pass without properly acknowledging someone's birthday. He spent considerable time with the junior staff Elena had personally trained over the years, learning directly from them the quiet acts of kindness and genuine mentorship she had consistently shown that he had genuinely never once witnessed himself. It proved slow, uncomfortable work, forcing himself to finally see, for the very first time, the complete pattern of blindness that had defined his entire adult life up to this point. But he pursued this difficult work with the same disciplined focus he had always brought to matters of strategy and leadership, because he understood, with a clarity that had come far too late, but had genuinely come nonetheless, that if he ever truly hoped to stand before Elena again with any dignity, he needed to become an entirely different man than the one who had so carelessly let her walk away. 6 full weeks after Elena's initial departure, Damien finally set out for Fairhollow, traveling entirely alone, without the customary retinue of guards and advisors that typically accompanied an Alpha King on any journey of genuine significance. He wanted no grand entrance, no elaborate display of power or accumulated authority. He wanted, for the very first time in his entire life, to arrive somewhere simply as himself, a man genuinely seeking to make right a terrible wrong he had been far too blind to properly see for far too long. The journey itself took 2 full days, and as he traveled steadily south, Damien found himself reflecting deeply on the strange, quiet courage it must have genuinely taken for Elena to walk this exact same road entirely alone, carrying nothing but a single modest bag and 9 full years of unspoken love, moving toward a future she could not have possibly been certain would ever welcome her. He thought of her constantly throughout each day of travel, wondered what she might currently be doing, whether she had genuinely found some measure of peace within her new life, whether there remained, after everything that had happened between them, any real possibility that she might eventually find it within herself to forgive him for 9 complete years of blindness. He arrived in Fairhollow on the evening of the 2nd full day, the settlement spreading out gently before him in the warm golden light of a beautiful sunset, entirely unfamiliar, yet quietly beautiful, in a way that felt completely different from the rigid, hierarchical structure of Ashwood. He secured modest lodging for the night at a small inn near the bustling market square, and though genuine exhaustion pressed heavily upon him after 2 full days of difficult travel, sleep did not come easily at all, his restless mind circling endlessly around the difficult question of how, after 9 full years of blindness followed by weeks of desperate searching, he might possibly even begin to make things genuinely right between them. Tomorrow, he told himself firmly, staring up at the entirely unfamiliar ceiling of the small inn room. Tomorrow he would finally begin the difficult search for Elena, and whatever happened next, he was genuinely determined to face it with the complete honesty and humility she had always truly deserved from him, and had never once, across 9 full years, actually received. He rose before dawn the following morning, unable to remain in bed any longer, and spent the early hours walking slowly through the quiet streets of Fairhollow, observing the settlement come gradually to life around him. He watched merchants opening their small shops for the day's business, watched children running through the market square on their way to some kind of morning lesson, watched the entire community move through its daily rhythms with an ease and comfort that spoke of genuine belonging rather than mere hierarchy. It was, he realized with some discomfort, precisely the kind of community Elena had likely never once experienced during her 9 years at Ashwood, where every single relationship existed within careful layers of rank and obligation. Here, in Fairhollow, she had apparently found something entirely different, something he was only now beginning to understand might have been genuinely necessary for her healing. The realization did nothing to ease his mounting anxiety about the difficult conversation ahead, but it did strengthen his resolve to approach Elena when he finally found her, with the humility Marla had so carefully warned him would prove absolutely essential. Finding Elena in Fairhollow proved considerably less difficult than Damien had anticipated it would be, though the relative ease of the search did absolutely nothing whatsoever to calm the anxious uncertainty that had steadily settled over him since his initial arrival. He began his search at the busy market square, making careful, respectful inquiries rather than demanding immediate answers, as his usual instincts strongly urged him to do. He described Elena carefully to those he spoke with, her steady bearing, her sharp and watchful eyes, her particular way of moving through any space, as though she had already mapped out every single corner of it in advance. A baker near the town center recognized the detailed description almost immediately, mentioning, with the easy openness characteristic of a genuinely small community, that a woman matching that exact description lived in the small room directly above her shop and worked for a prominent local merchant family known as the Ashfords. Damien thanked her sincerely, his heart pounding steadily, with a mixture of anticipation and genuine dread that felt entirely unfamiliar to a man who had spent his entire adult life projecting calm authority, even in the most dangerous and uncertain situations imaginable. He located the Ashford household without any real difficulty, a handsome, yet refreshingly unpretentious home, situated near the wide river. And it was there, standing outside the front gate, with his heart hammering hard against his ribs, that Damien finally caught his very first glimpse of Elena in 6 long, difficult weeks. She was standing in the garden, speaking easily with a tall, quiet-looking man Damien did not immediately recognize, and something about the easy comfort evident in their casual conversation, the genuine warmth clearly visible in Elena's expression, as she laughed softly at something the man had apparently said, struck Damien with a sudden, sharp pang of genuine fear that he might have already arrived far too late to fix anything. He watched silently for a moment, longer than he probably should have, taking in the complete sight of her, dressed simply but comfortably, her entire posture relaxed in a way he realized, with a fresh wave of guilt, he had genuinely rarely witnessed at Ashwood, where she had always carried herself with the careful, watchful readiness of someone perpetually remaining on duty. Finally, gathering the considerable courage that had carried him successfully through countless dangerous negotiations, but somehow felt entirely insufficient for this particular moment, Damien stepped forward decisively and called out her name. Elena turned quickly, and for a long suspended moment, she simply stared at him in obvious shock, as though her mind could not possibly reconcile the sight of Damien, Alpha King of Ashwood, standing entirely uninvited in the Ashford family garden, 6 full weeks and 2 full days' journey from everything genuinely familiar to her. "Damien," she said finally, her voice carefully neutral, betraying none of the visible shock that flickered briefly across her features before she managed to fully compose herself. The tall man standing beside her, Callum, as Damien would soon learn his name to be, looked carefully between the two of them with quiet, watchful attention, clearly sensing the considerable weight of the moment even without fully understanding its complete context. "I need to speak with you," Damien said, his voice noticeably rougher than he had intended it to sound, unsteady in a way that felt entirely foreign to his usual composed nature. Please, if you are genuinely willing to hear me out." Elena studied him carefully for a long moment, her expression remaining largely unreadable, and Damien found himself holding his breath entirely, uncertain whether she would flatly refuse him, whether 9 full years of silence followed by 6 additional weeks of complete separation had finally and permanently burned away whatever love she might have once carried for him. Finally, she turned toward Callum. "Would you please excuse us for a moment?" Callum nodded silently, his careful gaze lingering briefly on Damien, with a quiet, distinctly protective assessment before he retreated respectfully toward the main house, leaving Elena and Damien entirely alone together in the fading evening light of the garden. "You have exactly 5 minutes," Elena said, her arms crossing firmly over her chest, her voice remaining steady. Despite the visible storm, Damien could clearly see, flickering behind her carefully maintained composure. Damien had rehearsed this exact moment countless times throughout his 2 full days of difficult travel, had composed and subsequently discarded a full dozen different speeches along the way, and yet standing here now, facing the harsh reality of Elena's guarded, watchful eyes, every single one of his carefully prepared words entirely abandoned him. "I was wrong," he said instead, simply and with complete honesty. "For 9 full years, I was genuinely wrong. I allowed you to love me in complete silence, and I never once truly saw you, never once properly understood what your steady presence in my life actually meant, never once thanked you the way you genuinely deserved to be thanked. I treated your unwavering loyalty as though it were simply owed to me by right, rather than recognizing it as the precious gift you freely chose to give me, and I am genuinely ashamed of exactly how long it took me to finally understand that basic truth." Elena's careful expression flickered visibly, something deeply vulnerable breaking through her guarded composure, before she visibly steadied herself once more. "You still have not answered my original question, Damien. Why exactly are you here? What did you genuinely come all this way to say to me?" He took a careful step closer to her, his heart pounding steadily. "I came here to tell you that I love you, that I believe, somewhere beneath 9 full years of complete blindness, I have loved you for far longer than I ever once allowed myself to properly recognize or acknowledge. I came here to ask for your forgiveness, though I know full well I have absolutely no right to genuinely expect it from you. And I came here to beg you, with everything I have, to please come home." The heartfelt words hung suspended in the quiet evening air between them, and for a long, charged moment, Elena said absolutely nothing at all, her face carefully still, though Damien could clearly see the visible effort it took her to maintain that careful, guarded stillness. 9 years, she finally said, her voice quiet, but carrying a distinct edge of old, deeply buried pain. 9 full years, Damien. I remembered every single one of your birthdays without fail. I learned exactly how you preferred your tea prepared. I stood directly between a dangerous rogue and your entire family, and you looked at me afterward, as though I were merely a puzzle to solve, rather than a person who had genuinely just risked her own life for your household's safety. And across 9 complete years, you never once, not a single time, looked at me the way you are looking at me right now, in this exact moment. I know, Damien said, his voice breaking slightly with genuine emotion. I know that completely, and I have no adequate excuse that could ever properly explain why it took me so painfully long to see clearly. All I can genuinely tell you is that your absence finally forced me to see what your constant presence never once made me see, simply because I took it so entirely for granted. That failure belongs entirely to me, Elena, not to you. You did absolutely nothing wrong by loving me quietly for 9 full years. I did everything wrong by never once earning that precious love, and never once even properly recognizing that it genuinely existed. Elena's eyes glistened visibly in the fading evening light, though she continued holding herself with the same fierce, careful composure she had maintained throughout their entire difficult conversation. And what precisely happens if I do choose to come home with you? What happens in another 9 years, when the immediate crisis of this particular moment has fully passed, and you find yourself once again completely consumed by strategy and calculated alliances and endless border disputes? Do I simply return to being entirely invisible once again, comforted only by the fading memory of this one single moment when you finally, briefly noticed me? No, Damien said firmly, though he understood clearly, even as he said the word aloud. that mere words alone would never be sufficient to fully answer her legitimate fear. I will not simply ask you to trust my empty promise, Elena. I know completely well that such a promise means remarkably little after 9 full years of silence. But I am asking you, with complete sincerity, to let me prove it to you. However long that process genuinely takes, however much patience it ultimately requires of both of us, I will spend the entire remainder of my life proving that I truly see you, completely and fully see you, if you will simply give me the genuine chance to do so. Elena looked at him for a long, silent moment, the very last light of evening slowly fading into the soft blue darkness of dusk around them both, and Damien understood, with a fresh wave of genuine humility, that whatever answer she ultimately chose to give him now, he genuinely had no right to demand anything more than she was truly willing to freely offer. I need time, she finally said, though her voice now carried noticeably less of the guarded distance it had held during their very first difficult conversation in the Ashford garden. I have built something genuinely real here, Damien, an entire life that is completely and entirely my own, for the very first time since I was 16 years old. I will not simply abandon it because you have finally, belatedly decided to see me clearly. If you are genuinely serious about proving what you claim to feel, you will need to earn it, slowly and patiently, without ever expecting me to simply fall back into old familiar patterns, because doing so happens to be convenient for you. I understand completely, Damien said, and genuinely meant every word of it. Take whatever time you genuinely need to decide. I am not asking you to make any decision tonight. I am only asking you to please let me try. Elena studied him a moment longer in the deepening dusk, and then, finally, something within her carefully guarded expression softened noticeably. Just slightly, just enough to give Damien a fragile, precious thread of genuine hope to hold on to through whatever came next. You may stay in Fairhollow, she said quietly. For now at least, we shall simply see what happens from this point forward. It was not immediate forgiveness. It was not the joyful, tearful reunion Damien might have once imagined in his most hopeful private moments. But it was a door, left open just the smallest crack, and after 9 full years of blindness, followed by 6 desperate weeks of searching, Damien understood clearly that a door left open even slightly was considerably more than he genuinely had any right to expect, and more than enough to fill him with real hope for whatever might come next between them. Damien secured a modest room at the small inn near the market square and settled steadily into a strange, humbling new rhythm of daily life within Fairhollow, one entirely unlike anything he had genuinely known before as Alpha King of Ashwood. He did not press Elena for anything she was not ready to give. He had made her a genuine promise of patience, and he understood clearly, with a fresh clarity that had come to define his entire way of thinking since her departure, that a single broken promise now would only confirm every legitimate fear she had ever carried about his true capacity for genuine, lasting change. Instead, he found small, entirely unobtrusive ways to remain quietly present in her life, without ever demanding her time or her attention. He took on physical work, to Elena's evident surprise when she eventually learned of it through the close-knit gossip that traveled quickly through the small settlement, at the busy docks along the river, loading and unloading heavy cargo for the merchant boats that regularly passed through Fairhollow's active trade routes. It proved hard, genuinely demanding physical labor entirely unlike anything his royal position had ever previously required of him, and though his hands blistered painfully, and his back ached in ways entirely new and unfamiliar to him, he found a strange, genuine satisfaction in the honest work, a real sense of earning something meaningful through simple, honest effort, rather than through inherited authority alone. Word of his continued presence spread quickly through the small settlement, and though most residents treated him with the same curious but respectful distance they naturally extended to any newcomer, Elena's employer, Garrett Ashford, sought him out directly within his very first week. "You are the Alpha King who came here looking for Elena," Garrett said, finding Damien during a brief break from his physical dock work, his tone carrying a distinctly blunt note of careful assessment. "She has not said a great deal about you, but the little she has genuinely shared suggests you have a considerable amount to make up for." "I do," Damien admitted readily, without any trace of defensiveness. "I fully intend to spend as much time as it genuinely takes to prove that to her." Garrett studied him carefully for a long moment, then finally nodded slowly, Elena is a genuinely remarkable woman. My entire family has come to value her enormously in the relatively short time she has worked closely with us. If you are truly serious about earning back her trust, I would strongly suggest you begin by genuinely understanding what it actually means to see someone completely, rather than simply using them well for your own purposes. The carefully chosen words echoed uncomfortably with the similar accusation Reyna had leveled at him weeks earlier, and Damien absorbed them fully, with the same growing humility he was slowly learning to carry with him. "I am genuinely trying," he said simply. "Every single day, without fail." Over the following weeks, a careful, tentative rhythm gradually began to develop between Damien and Elena. He did not seek her out uninvited, but whenever their paths naturally crossed within the small settlement, as they inevitably and regularly did, he made a genuine point of engaging in attentive, meaningful conversation, rather than the distracted efficiency that had characterized their entire 9 years of interactions back at Ashwood. He asked about her ongoing work with the Ashford family, and listened, truly and completely listened, to her thoughtful answers. He asked about her individual days, her private thoughts, the small meaningful details of her new life that had absolutely nothing whatsoever to do with his own needs or priorities. Slowly, patiently, he began to learn genuinely new things about Elena he had never once known, despite 9 full years of her constant presence throughout his entire life. He learned that she genuinely loved to read, that she held a particular fondness for stories about distant lands and unfamiliar customs, that she had patiently taught herself, over many years, to identify dozens of different flowering plants, simply by carefully observing the gardens at Ashwood during her rare quiet moments alone. He learned that she had always genuinely wanted to travel, to see the distant coastal territories she had only ever heard about in old traveling stories, a cherished dream she had quietly set entirely aside for 9 full years, in favor of a devotion that had never once been genuinely returned to her in kind. He also learned, through careful, patient conversation over many weeks, about her difficult childhood before Ashwood, about the family she had tragically lost, about the deep fear and grief that had ultimately shaped her into someone who found genuine safety in being consistently useful, in making herself entirely indispensable to others, as a way of ensuring she would never again be left behind or completely forgotten. Understanding this painful history, difficult as it genuinely was to hear, helped Damien understand, with a fresh wave of genuine guilt, exactly how deeply his 9 years of blindness had truly wounded her. Elena had given him her complete loyalty not simply out of love alone, but out of a desperate quiet hope that being useful enough, devoted enough, patient enough, might finally earn her the permanent sense of belonging she had lost so young in her difficult life. And he had accepted that considerable devotion for 9 full years, without ever once recognizing the fragile, hopeful heart that genuinely beat behind it. One particular evening, nearly a full month into Damien's extended stay in Fairhollow, Elena found him sitting alone by the wide river, after his long day's work at the busy docks, his hands still rough and heavily calloused from labor entirely unfamiliar to a man born into considerable royal privilege. "You have genuinely changed," she observed quietly, settling onto the grassy riverbank beside him, close enough for real conversation, but still maintaining a careful distance that spoke clearly to the fragile, tentative nature of whatever was slowly rebuilding steadily between them. "I am genuinely trying to," Damien said honestly. "I understand clearly now that simply trying is not the same as fully succeeding, and I do not expect you to simply take my word for it without proof. But I am trying every single day without fail to become someone who genuinely deserves to stand beside you, rather than someone who simply expects your continued devotion without ever properly earning it in return." Elena watched the steady river flow past them for a long, quiet moment before finally speaking again. "Callum asked me, just last week, whether I genuinely intend to return to Ashwood eventually." Damien's chest tightened noticeably at the casual mention of the other man's name, though he forced himself to remain outwardly calm, to consciously resist the possessive jealousy that would have once come far too easily to him in the past. "What did you tell him in response?" "I told him honestly that I did not yet know," Elena said with complete honesty. "I genuinely still do not know, Damien. I have built something entirely real here for myself, something completely and entirely my own. And I will not simply abandon it because you have finally learned to see me clearly. no matter how much that hard-won recognition genuinely means to me personally. I do not want you to abandon anything whatsoever, Damien said carefully. If you ultimately choose to remain here in Fairhollow, if that is genuinely where your true happiness lies, then I will find some way to accept that fully, even though doing so would genuinely break something essential within me to lose you again after everything. I am not here to demand that you return to Ashwood simply because doing so happens to be convenient for me. I am here because I genuinely love you, and because I finally understand completely that real love means valuing your happiness above my own personal comfort. Elena turned to look directly at him then, something in her careful expression visibly shifting, softening in a way Damien had not once witnessed since his initial arrival in Fairhollow. 9 full years, and I never once heard you speak those particular words aloud. I love you. I genuinely should have said them many years ago, Damien admitted freely. I should have recognized clearly what I truly felt, long before your painful absence finally forced me to confront it honestly. I cannot possibly undo 9 years of complete silence, Elena. But I can genuinely promise you that from this exact moment forward, you will never again have reason to wonder whether you are truly seen, whether you are genuinely valued, whether your presence in my life is simply being taken entirely for granted. They sat together quietly by the river as the evening deepened steadily around them both, and though Elena did not offer immediate forgiveness, did not promise any immediate return to Ashwood, something had genuinely shifted between them, a fragile but authentic warmth that had never once existed throughout their entire 9 years together at the pack house. I need considerably more time, Elena finally said, though her voice now carried noticeably less of the guarded distance it had held during their very first conversation. But I am no longer entirely certain that door you once spoke of remains only open a small crack, Damien. Perhaps it is genuinely beginning to open somewhat wider now. It was not everything Damien had genuinely hoped for, but after 9 full years of blindness, followed by many weeks of careful, humble effort to finally earn what he had never once genuinely deserved, it proved enough to fill him with a fragile, cautious hope unlike anything he had ever known before, and he understood clearly, watching Elena's face soften gently in the fading evening light, that whatever came next between them, he had finally begun walking the long, genuinely difficult road toward truly deserving the love she had faithfully carried for him, in silence for so very many years. In the days that followed this quiet breakthrough, their careful conversations grew steadily longer, their comfortable silences grew increasingly natural rather than tense, and Damien found himself, for the very first time in his entire adult life, genuinely looking forward to the simple, unremarkable moments of an ordinary day, rather than only to matters of strategy and power. He began to understand, slowly and completely, that this quiet, patient rebuilding between them mattered infinitely more than any grand gesture or dramatic declaration ever could. 2 more full months passed steadily, before Elena finally made her ultimate decision, months during which Damien remained faithfully in Fairhollow, continuing his honest work at the busy docks, continuing his patient, unhurried presence in her life, never once pressing her for more than she was genuinely willing to give freely. Throughout that considerable time, he wrote regularly to Ashwood, managing the affairs of his pack from a careful distance, with the dedicated help of his trusted Beta Council, trusting them, for the very first time, throughout his entire reign, with significant responsibilities he had once insisted on personally handling, entirely by himself. It was, he realized with growing clarity, another small but meaningful lesson Elena's absence had genuinely taught him, that true leadership never truly required controlling every single detail personally, but rather trusting and genuinely valuing the capable people around him enough to properly share the considerable weight of responsibility. He also, during those formative months, began corresponding regularly with Marla, whose gruff but genuinely authentic affection for both Damien and Elena made her an invaluable source of honest, unflinching counsel throughout the entire process. Her letters, whenever they arrived, were never soft or falsely flattering, always remaining honest in their careful assessment of whether Damien's continued personal growth seemed genuinely authentic or merely convenient for the moment, and Damien found himself genuinely grateful for her unflinching honesty in a way he would have once found considerably irritating. Slowly, steadily, the daily rhythm of Fairhollow became genuinely familiar to him. He came to know many of the residents by their proper names, came to understand the particular pace and character of a settlement built on genuine cooperation rather than inherited hierarchy, came to appreciate, in his quieter reflective moments, the authentic peace Elena had managed to find in building an entire life completely her own, free from 9 full years of silent devotion to someone who had never once truly seen her clearly. And slowly, carefully, the emotional distance between Damien and Elena continued steadily to soften with each passing week. Their conversations grew noticeably longer, considerably more comfortable, filled increasingly with genuine laughter that had rarely existed between them throughout their many years together at Ashwood. Damien learned to ask about her day and truly listen carefully to her answer. He learned to notice the small things that genuinely troubled her, the particular tilt of her head when she was working through a difficult thought, the quiet furrow of her brow whenever the Ashford accounts proved especially challenging. He learned, in essence, everything he genuinely should have learned across 9 full years, but had somehow never once thought to. Callum, for his own part, had gracefully stepped back once it became genuinely clear where Elena's heart truly lay, though he remained a sincere, valued friend to her throughout the entire remaining process, and Elena, in turn, made absolutely certain Damien understood that Callum's genuine kindness during her early, difficult days in Fairhollow deserved authentic respect and gratitude, not the possessive jealousy Damien occasionally still struggled somewhat to fully release from his heart. On a warm evening in early autumn, nearly 3 full months after Damien's initial arrival in Fairhollow, Elena found him once again sitting by the familiar river, watching the sunset paint the water in brilliant shades of orange and warm gold, and this particular time, she settled comfortably beside him, without maintaining the careful distance that had once defined their earlier conversations. "I have finally made my decision," she said quietly, with complete certainty. Damien's heart pounded steadily, though he forced himself to remain outwardly calm, to patiently wait for her to continue without pressing her for more. "I love you," Elena said, the simple words landing direct and unadorned, in a way that struck Damien with entirely unexpected force, after 9 full years of silence, followed by many months of careful, patient rebuilding between them. "I have genuinely loved you, for far longer than either of us truly understood at the time. And I sincerely believe, now, that you have genuinely changed, not perfectly, and not entirely completely, but genuinely, in exactly the ways that matter most between us." "Elena," Damien began, but she raised a gentle hand, quietly asking him to let her finish speaking completely. "I will return to Ashwood together with you," she continued steadily, "but not simply as your household staff, and not as someone whose entire worth is measured only by her usefulness, rather than by genuine, equal partnership. If I return with you, it will be as your true equal. As your Luna, if that is genuinely and truly what you want, but a Luna who is fully seen and properly valued for exactly who she is, not merely for what she can consistently do for you." "That is precisely and exactly what I want," Damien said, his voice thick with genuine emotion he no longer even attempted to hide from her. "I want you as my true partner, my complete equal, my beloved Luna, and my love, in absolutely every meaningful sense of those words. I will spend the entire remainder of my life proving that you made the right choice in choosing to trust me again." Elena smiled then, a genuine, warm smile that reached completely up into her eyes, something Damien had genuinely rarely witnessed from her throughout their 9 years together at Ashwood, and something he understood clearly now, with genuinely humbling clarity, that he fully intended to spend the entire rest of his life properly earning. They were married in a quiet, intimate ceremony exactly 3 weeks later, not the grand, coldly strategic alliance that had once been carefully planned with Raina, but a genuine celebration, attended by the close friends Elena had made throughout her months in Fairhollow, by Marla and Corwin who traveled south specifically for the joyful occasion, by the entire Ashford family who had come to genuinely value Elena's presence during her formative months within their household. Elena wore, at her own genuine insistence, a simple dress rather than elaborate ceremonial robes, and carried, in a small, deeply sentimental gesture that brought genuine tears to Damien's eyes when he finally understood its full significance, a single pressed flower, from the very same tree beneath which he had once, many years earlier, offered her a brief moment of unknowing comfort during his own private grief. They returned together to Ashwood as true equals, and Elena stepped confidently into her new role as Luna, not as the quiet, invisible presence she had once carefully maintained, but as a woman fully seen, genuinely valued, and completely loved. She continued bringing her sharp intelligence and steady competence to the careful management of pack affairs, but now her considerable contributions were openly acknowledged, genuinely celebrated, woven directly into the very fabric of how the entire pack understood its own shared leadership. Damien, for his own part, never again allowed 9 full years to pass without properly acknowledging what genuinely mattered most in his life. He remembered Elena's birthday faithfully, every single year afterward, celebrating it with the same genuine care she had once shown consistently toward his own birthday, without ever once expecting any recognition in return. He learned, slowly but genuinely, to truly see the people around him, not simply for their usefulness to him, but for the complete, complicated humanity of exactly who they truly were as individuals. Years later, when their own children eventually asked how their parents had genuinely fallen in love, Elena would tell the complete story simply, without any trace of bitterness, of 9 full years of quiet devotion, of a difficult departure that had finally forced two people to clearly see what had always genuinely been true between them, and of a love that, though it took far too long to be properly recognized, had ultimately proven strong enough to survive both painful silence and difficult separation, emerging on the other side considerably stronger, more genuinely honest, and more truly equal than it had ever once been before. And though the 9 years of silence could never be fully reclaimed or entirely undone, Elena found, in all the years that followed her eventual return to Ashwood, that every single day, Damien spent genuinely proving his love, truly seeing her, authentically valuing her, was a day that slowly, steadily healed the quiet ache of all the difficult years that had come before, until finally, she understood with complete and total certainty that she had never truly lost anything meaningful by finally choosing, after 9 long years, to walk away when she genuinely needed to. She had simply, quietly, made room for something considerably better to finally begin.